Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'm going to be giving you guys a quick guide to Catweaving, something that I've actually had a few people ask me about. This will work for both Guardian Druids as well as Restoration Druids. It's definitely stronger if you're a part of the Necrolord Covenant, though it's not required, and I'll explain that a little bit later because I know a lot of you guys are Night Fae. Remember though, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe to be notified when I post more Warcraft content, and let's get right into it. Starting off with, what is Catweaving? Well, like the name implies, it basically involves you weaving in and out of cat form using feral abilities in order to increase your DPS. For Guardian Druids, this involves shifting out of bear form into cat form and basically shifting back and forth, maintaining your dots. It makes that kind of impossible to do in Mythic Plus. I mean, there's very niche cases, but in raids it can be actually quite strong. Specifically on single target fights that have high tank downtime. A great example of this is Artificer Zymox, where depending on your push timings, you can be the inactive tank for around a minute. A bad example would be something like Council of Blood, where both tanks are constantly doing something for the vast majority of the fight, so you can't really shift out of bear form into cat form. For Resto Druid, since you're not actively tanking anything, it's not really a big deal. It works on pretty much every raid fight, and it works in dungeons as well. Again, better in single target situations than AoE, but it's still decent in cleave and AoE scenarios for Resto as well. In terms of talent choice, what we've got here, obviously you need to have Feral Affinity. You're not going to have your Feral spells if you don't have Feral Affinity. Heart of the Wild is also a big DPS cooldown for you here. In Feral Affinity, this increases the damage of your Feral abilities by 30%, and critical strikes with attacks that generate a combo point generate an additional combo point. So that's a solid DPS cooldown. Normally you want to pair this with Bloodlust, though on fights that are longer than 5 to 6 minutes where we're able to fit in multiple, you may want to just rip this as you get it, depending on the fight. For Resto Druids, that's all you really need. None of your other talent abilities will affect this. For Guardian Druids, there's a couple other talents you'll want to take. First being Galactic Guardian. This gives you your damage has a 5% chance to trigger a free automatic Moonfire on the target. When this occurs, the next Moonfire you cast generates 8 rage and deals 300% increased damage. This synergizes quite well with the Catweaving legendary that I'll be talking about later on. And it's important to note that this can trigger while you're doing cat form DPS, which gives you just some extra free damage, resulting in you spending very little time worrying about actually maintaining your Moonfire. The other beneficial talent here is Rend and Tear, where each stack of your Thrash reduces the target's damage to you by 2% and increases your own damage to them by 2%, which basically just boils down to a flat 6% damage increase at all times, assuming you're able to just maintain your Thrash stacks on the target, which is fairly easy to do. Now, why is this build so much better in single target situations? As I've mentioned a couple times previously, the main benefit is a legendary power that amplifies the damage of Catweaving significantly only in single target with the Draft of Deep Focus. So there it is. When Moonfire, Rake, Rip, or Rejuvenation are active on a single target, their effects are increased by 40%. Because both Guardians and Restoration Druids are able to keep up all 3 of those dots, Moonfire, Rake, and Rip, on their target while Catweaving, it makes their single target damage exceptionally strong. All this damage is also further amplified by being a Necrolord. As I mentioned here, I'll open up Adaptive Swarm. This commands a Swarm. It's another dot, deals shadow damage over 12 seconds, and it increases the effectiveness of your other periodic effects, all of which are amplified also by this legendary. And it also amplifies, of course, your Thrash damage that you're also maintaining, or your Sunfire damage that you're also maintaining. So this is just a nice synergy to have with this legendary, and it's a sizable damage increase on single target. This damage amp can also be further increased by a Conduit and Evolved Swarm, adding up to just below 10% more on this effect. On the topic of conduits, let's talk Soulbinds. For Necrolords, I find Bonesmith Airmere to be the best option, as he provides you with a flat 3% agility or intellect for restoration, a single potency slot for the previously mentioned Evolved Swarm conduit, and a solid crit buff in Marrowed Gemstone. The other potency conduits for Guardian are fairly lacking when it comes to damage output, and of course Restos are focused around healing throughput, so neither really stack up compared to the Marrowed Gemstone conduit slot at the bottom. With the bookkeeping stuff done, though, let's actually get into the rotation stuff. So this is going to be a little bit different for both Guardian and Resto Druids, though the general idea is similar. Starting with the Guardian Druids, though, first thing, you're looking to maintain your bear form Thrash. Now that's an important thing to note. Do not use Thrash in cat form. They are different abilities. So if I actually have taken it off my bars in cat form. But if you actually put it back onto your bars, I have to find it. There it is. Let's put it on there. Right, so I'm building my Thrash stacks, and let me just actually Palp Berserk so I can build it faster. So I have my 3 Thrash stacks here. I press Thrash to try and refresh it in cat form. Does nothing, and then it actually removes your bear form Thrash stacks. That's very bad. You just want to take that cat form Thrash and take it off of your bars. But yeah, so you are looking to maintain your Thrash stacks, your bear form Thrash stacks on the target to keep that 6% buff from Rend and Tear. You also want to maintain Moonfire, though this is quite easy because of Galactic Guardian. It tends to see it'll usually maintain itself. You may need to occasionally cast a regular Moonfire if you get pretty unlucky with procs, but it will usually maintain itself. For Thrash, you pretty much just want to, while you're Catweaving, you'll be doing your thing, and then you want to shift back into bear form to refresh these Thrash stacks. Near the pandemic window is fine. So just here, shift back, and then you can shift back into cat form. That's what you do to maintain your Thrash. After maintaining Thrash and Moonfire, in terms of the feral stuff, you just want to maintain as high an uptime on Rake and Rip as possible, filling with Shred to gain combo points. If you're able to build up more than 5 combo points between needing to refresh your Rip, so for example now I don't really need to refresh this Rip, you can just Ferocious Bite in between the fill. This usually only happens during your Heart of the Wild Bloodlust windows, but you can spend it on Ferocious Bite for a little bit of extra damage boost. Outside of those windows, it's pretty hard, depending on the boss fight, of course. It entirely depends on the boss fight, but usually as a tank, it's hard to gain up another 5 combo points after your initial 5. And there's going to be a little situation I'll explain about later where you actually won't want to spend those combo points. On top of this, if you are a Necrolord, you'll want to be using Adaptive Swarm offensively every time, because you can cast it defensively, and you just cast it. And since it's not actually affected by the Pandemic Refresh window, you just want to basically recast it when this dot is fairly low. So you see it's going to jump to an ally right now. I'm going to wait for it to go back onto the enemy target. And since there's only one enemy target, you know exactly where it's going to end up. That's another reason why this is better on single target. There, see, I do have it. I'm not going to cast it, because what I can do is I can hold it to increase my offensive uptime of the spell. If I just wait here till fairly late, and then refresh it, it goes all the way back to its full duration with more stacks. So basically, I'm just not doubling, but I'm drastically increasing the offensive uptime portion of Adaptive Swarm by waiting to refresh that. And you can do that every time. So you see, like, it's going to happen again in 7 seconds. I'll have it up. It'll still be here. I'm not going to cast it yet. I'm just going to weave it in as this starts getting lower. I'll just wait till near the end to refresh it. And if you get scared, you can refresh it a little bit early. It's not a big deal, but basically you're just trying to increase the uptime of this dot. So you won't exactly be using this on cooldown. Sometimes you may hold it for a few seconds. Other times you want to fire it instantly because it's very, very close to coming off. Just depends on the timing. And essentially it's a nice little trick you can do to just increase your uptime on that spell and that damage amp for your other dots. That's the gist of the general rotation for Guardian. So there's a few intricacies I wanted to talk about, and the first being these Galactic Guardian procs. Because Moonfire is not usable in cat form, here I'll put it back on my bars to show you guys. Right, if I try to cast Moonfire here, it pulls me to caster form. So it's not usable in cat form, so that means it's going to eat 2 globals, right? Because you have this global, and then you have a global to shift. So that eats 2 globals to use a Galactic Guardian proc while in cat form. What this ends up meaning is that outside of your Heart of the Wild windows, so when you don't have Heart of the Wild active, casting Galactic Guardian, casting a Galactic Guardian buff Moonfire versus just shredding twice is roughly the same amount of damage. The benefits is that if you choose Shred, is that you get 2 combo points, whereas if you use a Galactic Guardian, it costs you 0 energy. This means that if you're looking to maximize damage, you should be holding Galactic Guardian procs. For example, I have this. I'm now low energy, I can't cast Shred, so I shift out, and then I can shift back in. And now I have energy to do things again, and I'm not energy capped. Right, so that's kind of something you can look to do if you're maximizing damage. So when you don't have enough energy to Shred, then you use your Galactic Guardian procs, and that in turn gives you just a little bit more time to generate energy so you can do things if you go back into cat form. Note that if you do currently have Heart of the Wild active though, it's always worth it to just ignore the Galactic Guardian proc and just use Shred, because the 30% additional damage you get and the potential for extra combo points is just much better. Also, if you're in bear form, refreshing your Thrash stacks, at that time you get a Galactic Guardian proc, or you already had one, it is always worth it to press that button. You're not giving up another global to use it if you're in bear form, so you just might as well always press that button if you're already in bear form. The other little thing you can do on Guardian is actually hold your combo points so that you can apply a full duration rip at a later time rather than using Ferocious Bite or refreshing rip early. And there's also times where you would want to refresh your rake early as well. The main time you would do any of these things is if you're you're going to have to taunt the boss back soon. So before you're able to refresh your current rake or rip on the target in the pandemic window, you're going to have to taunt the boss back. And so the way the damage on rake works is, if you look, so there, it did 700 and then 600 damage. That was a trinket proc. Ignore that. So I go over to this guy. That's 900. So basically, if your rake triggers once, it's technically more damage than a shred. So if, hey, I'm at this point, I've got to taunt the boss back in 2 seconds, that's okay. I've gotten 1 tick of my rake, that's fine. I'll refresh rake and then I'll taunt back. That is a damage increase over doing a shred instead of that. An example of a boss you have to do this on is like Hungering Destroyer, right? Where the tank taunt windows are what, like 12 seconds, something very, very short like that. So that's a good example of a fight where you do this a decent amount on, but it's a little bit niche. With the Guardian stuff done, we can take a look at Resto for a second. It's much simpler. Like Guardian, you'll want to maintain Moonfire, but instead of maintaining Thrash, you're actually just maintaining your Sunfire dot. So it's Moonfire, Sunfire, and then the normal cat stuff, as previously mentioned, Rake, 5 combo point rip, Ferocious Biting, normally just during the windows, but it depends actually. As Resto Druid, you can get a few more Ferocious Bites off because you're not really tanking as much, right? So you're usually able to cat weave a little bit more. Necrolord ability works the exact same way. You want to refresh it late. And because you're not juggling and you don't have to maintain that Thrash stacks, it's just the 1-button Sunfire. This is definitely a lot more straightforward as a Resto Druid. The one tip I would give is, Sunfire is a lot shorter. I wouldn't worry about refreshing Sunfire on its own. It's also not amped by the legendary damage. It's only amped by the Adaptive Swarm. So when Moonfire is going out, just also refresh Sunfire. Because on its own, Sunfire's not a great amount of damage in single target. But if you're just using the 1 GCD for it, again, because you're already in caster form, you're already refreshing Moonfire, you might as well refresh Sunfire at that point. So usually you're not going to have 100% uptime on Sunfire, and that's okay. Don't worry about that. From there, despite it being quite late in the tier, I figured I would go over all of the Castle Nathria fights and give you some tips on Catweaving during them. This for the most part will apply to Guardian Druids. Not really a big Resto Druid thing. Again, it's much easier to do this as Resto Druid because you're not juggling the boss. So I'll mostly be going over these from the perspective of a Guardian Druid. So let's talk Castle Nathria. Shriekwing. Shriekwing is a boss where you are lusting on pull. Despite lusting on pull, you actually prefer to be the first tank on this because he casts his tank hit, Exsanguinating Bite, very, very early on. So you can just eat that tank hit, pop your Heart of the Wild because your other tank taunts off, and then most of your Heart of the Wild window is in that Bloodlust. Aside from that, it's pretty straightforward. You do get a decent amount of uptime on the boss here. So it's a pretty good Catweaving fight. Huntsman Ultimar is the complete opposite. You cannot Catweave on this fight because you are always tanking something. So I mean, that's really all there is to it. You can't Catweave on this fight, so it's unfortunate. It's one of like I think there's like 3 bosses where Catweaving is kind of rough or impossible in this area, or in this raid. Sorry, so Huntsman is one of them. Sun King, Catweaving is not impossible here. It's just not very good. I guess what you would say. If you're not the Sun King tank, you can just Catweave that entire phase. That really depends on your tank makeup and what your tanks are doing in that fight. For example, on Mythic, our Vengeance Demon Hunter is busy DCing the Phoenixes. So I have to tank Sun King, and so I don't get to Catweave at all. So at that point, it's not very good. Also, of course, Resto Affinity is very good on this fight also. And if you're Resto Affinity healing Kael'thas, you can't be Catweaving. And so just a fight where you can Catweave is just not very good. Artificer, as I mentioned, very, very good for Catweaving. Where you're going to want to pop Heart of the Wild will depend entirely on your push timings, because these change the fight actually a lot. So, for example, when we were holding Lust for the gap in Phase 3, it was very beneficial for me to actually not save Heart of the Wild for that gap, because I was tanking during that gap. But actually to use it just before we triggered that gap, because as we pushed over 60%, we got rid of the tank debuff there. It never happened, so he went on a timer again. So I was Catweaving for closer to a minute, and that was the best time for me to pop Heart of the Wild. When we were lusting on pull, the best time was actually to pop Heart of the Wild on pull if I wasn't tanking, because we would go right through the first tank debuff and we wouldn't get one for like 30 to 40 seconds, or for more than that, 40 to 50 seconds. On pull, and so I would get my entire Heart of the Wild in Bloodlust on pull when we did that. So it just depends on your own personal push timings, but in general, there's always going to be some good time for you to Heart of the Wild on Artificer because of the big tank downtime. Hungering Destroyer, it's pretty decent for Catweaving. The only problem is you don't get a ton of downtime, just because the tank swap is so quick. It's about 12 seconds, but usually you can build up a full rip, a full 5 combo point rip. You can rip, and then you can go back to tanking, and so you actually end up getting pretty decent uptime on both rake and rip on this fight, despite you taunting back and forth so often. And so it ends up being a pretty solid Catweaving fight. Doesn't really matter when you're the tank on this fight, just because it's so often you're swapping. So whichever you feel more comfortable with. We've got Lady and Nerva next, and this one definitely does matter. You want to be the second tank on this fight, and that's because the best time for you to Catweave and pop Heart of the Wild is actually on pull, especially on Mythic. On Mythic, you're lusting on pull, and so you get the entire lust duration with your Heart of the Wild if you let your co-tank go to 3 stacks on pull. Just on pull, usually you want to taunt at 2 stacks, but on pull you can go to 3 stacks just to get a little bit more damage out. The problem is Catweaving mid-fight can get a little tricky, because one, you're going to have that tank ad that spawns usually, then you'll have 2 things to juggle, or 2, you're going to have a couple stacks of her dot, which does not tickle, and so that kind of leaves the little bit of time between when there's no ad up and you're not high on stacks, so your stacks have kind of expired, and so that doesn't really leave you with a lot of time outside of the opener to Catweave, so you have to get a lot of your Catweaving damage out initially. It's still definitely worthwhile because it's a pretty tight DPS check, but you get most of your Catweaving done up front with your Bloodlust, with your Heart of the Wild on pull. Council, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's pretty much impossible to Catweave on this fight. You're tanking something for the vast majority of the fight, even when only Niklaus is up in the last phase. The Gargoyle is around too sometimes, right? So a lot of the times you are tanking something. It's just not worth Catweaving. Sludge Fist. Like Council of Blood, you are tanking something a lot of the time. Unlike Council of Blood, it is still worth the Catweave, because pillars, depending on your pillar RNG, you can actually fit in a full rip, so a 5 combo point rip during the pillar stun, even on Mythic. So if you get lucky with where the puddles are falling, you're still in melee range of the boss as a tank, if you're lucky. And so you're able to fit in a full rake. Worst case, you get like 3 to 4 combo points instead, and you just let that rip go. because it's not worth holding on, because pretty much every pillar you can get 4 to 5 combo points quite easily, even if the boss isn't in range of you initially. Definitely worth that extra damage though. Stone Legion is the third boss in here that I wouldn't recommend Catweaving, at least on Mythic. There's just a lot of stuff going on there. You're usually tanking something. Almost the entire fight you'll be tanking something. So it's really, you don't have very much time, if any at all, to start Catweaving, so it's just not worthwhile there. Same deal with Council, same deal with Huntsman. Sire is one where phase 1 and phase 3 you can Catweave. Phase 2 you cannot, because again, that sword is out, you're always tanking something, you're always running around doing stuff. But it actually can add a decent amount of damage to your phase 3 for when you're not actively tanking things, so it can be a nice little damage boost, and that phase 3 is a fairly tight DPS check, so it can help you out a bunch with that. But that's pretty much it for my Catweaving tips, guys. Remember, if you learned anything, make sure to like and subscribe to be notified when I post more content. If you have any questions on Catweaving, playing Guardian, tanking in general, feel free to leave a comment below and I will do my best to answer it. You can also check me out live on my Twitch at Tactics and ask your questions there. That wraps up this video though. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.